guys, this episode we're going to be talking about how to configure multiple databases in your Rails application. And this is particularly relevant because Rails 8 includes the solid gems by default: solid cache, solid queue, and solid cable. Each of these are database-backed versions of the Rails cache, active jobs, queue adapter, and action cables backend. So you don't have to run Redis, which is awesome. But this requires you to understand how multiple databases are configured and how they work in Active Record. So let's dig into our database YAML where most of this is going to live. So at the very bottom, you're going to have a section here for production that's going to define your primary database, your cache, your queue, and your cable databases. But if you look up in development and test, none of those exist, not even primary. And by default, if you just define a database in here directly, it's going to be your primary database configuration. So Rails is smart enough to look for those nested keys and determine whether or not you have multiple databases or you're just configuring your primary one. By default, that's all you're doing. But I really want to run the same gems in development as I do in production, so hopefully I catch any issues before I deploy it. So let's go over to our production.rb file, and I'm going to copy over these lines for the solid cache store, the solid queue backend, and the solid queue database connection configuration here. So we're going to put those in development.rb. And I'm just going to paste them here at the bottom so we have the latest. Oops, let me grab them back to my clipboard. There we go. And we will save that, and that's going to be what configures Rails to use solid cache and solid queue. And under cable.yml, this is where we can also set the adapter for development for solid cable. So by doing that, we are now going to, and we might as well just grab all of these over here and make them match. By doing that, we've switched our development environment to run all of the solid gems as well. But now we need to go to our database YML and set up our production, or copy our production database configs and go to development and paste them in. So first off, we need to add primary as a key here and nest all of those configuration options in there. You might need to specify your username, your password, and other options for that. And they would go here under primary in order to keep them separate from the cache, queue, and cable ones. We also want to have these probably inherit, instead of from primary production, also inherit from default, same as above. And because we're using Postgres in this example, they're all looking to talk to localhost 5432 is the port that is the default, and that's all handled automatically with the Postgres adapter. It knows the default host and ports for those. But we do need our database names and migration paths to be different. And we want these to be called development instead of production, so we'll make that change as well. And that should get us with 4 databases set up for development and 4 databases set up for production. They're going to share the adapter, the encoding, and the pool size. In production, you might want to change the pool size. You also might want to change the pool size for different databases, potentially as well. So you can control those separately by adding the pool down at the bottom as well. But let's open up our Rails console in development and poke around at what we've got. So if we look at application record, we can ask for the connection DB config, and that's going to give us this hash config object back. It knows the environment and the name of the database that is configured for application record. What's also cool is if we look at solid queue and we'll look at like the job class, that is one of the active record models, we can look for its connection DB config, and it is going to also be a hash config, but it's going to look at the queue section inside of our database YAML. Same thing applies to solid cable and solid cache. You can go ask for those models and their connection DB config, and you will see exactly what is pulled out of your database YAML. If, for whatever reason, you're missing one of these, let's say we accidentally forgot queue, we can run Rails console again, run the SolidQ connection DB config, and you might have seen this message before. The Q database is not configured for the development environment. So it knows under development, it is going to look for Q, but we only got primary, cache, and cable. Test just has the default database, which is primary, even though it doesn't say it. It's not explicitly named in the YAML file. And same for production. So it's just telling you, hey, we can't find that database config that you're looking for. And that would tell you you need to go to find that in your environment section in database YAML. So this is good. It gets everything wired up for us. You can run Rails DB prepare in order to take the schemas that come with these multiple databases and load them for development. If we look into DB, you will see that instead of just DB schema like you normally have, you also have cable schema, cache schema, and queue schema. And so these are what are used for those gems, and they can be loaded so that it creates those database tables in the database and gets you all set up and ready to go. All right, so everything there is pretty much what we need. That is getting us to being able to run our multiple databases. And then one other thing that I wanted to mention is the plugin for SolidQ in the Puma file will run SolidQ inside of Puma and shut it down whenever Puma shuts down, which can be really handy. This is the default for Kamal, but we also might want to do this for development, so we don't have to run SolidQ separately in another tab or with Overmind or Foreman. You could change this and say, or rails.env.development, and have it automatically run the SolidQ plugin whenever Rails is running there. And so that's an option for you as well if you want to use that. All right, so now let's talk about how we can use this in production. So our database YAML, let's pull that up. Our database YAML in production has basically the primary config. It has somehow, it looks for database URL as the environment variable in order to override these configurations in the file. And this is super handy for Hatchbox, Heroku, Fly, and Render, and any other hosting service where you can create a database and it will supply you an environment variable with the adapter name, the username, the password, the host, the port, and the database name. And you basically just say, hey, grab everything out of that environment variable and use it for the configuration. Whatever's in my YAML file is not as important as that is. So it will use those by default and ensure that these are the values used for the username and password, even though you might have set those up differently in your YAML file. This is great for deploying, but it will look for a specific database URL environment variable, which we all have probably used at some point. Now, we can point it to different environment variables by specifying a URL key, and we have to give it a name and then make sure that we create the environment variable with the right URL for our database. Which is another good option. But I always wondered, how do we do that for each of these other databases that aren't going to use database URL? I'd prefer not to have to set up a URL for each one of them. And it turns out Rails actually does this internally. So let's check this out. If we were to specify database URL, we can say PostgreSQL. It's got a user, a pass, and it goes to a host, and let's say 1234 is our port, and we say we're going to call it DB. This is going to set the primary database credentials to this. So when we go to our application record connection DB config, this time it's actually a URL config instead of a hash config. And it still knows it's for the primary database and the development environment, but it was able to parse this database URL for us and pull out the host, which is host. I don't know, I assume you can't get port from there, but we can definitely get database, and it will give us DB. And it's able to pull this stuff out of that environment variable and grab that and override what's in our database YAML, which is really handy. For other things like our SolidQ connection config, our database is going to be what's in the file, because this is going to give us that hash config back. And so the objects that we have when we call this are going to kind of tell us where it pulled and detected that from. So this is really handy, but there's actually a feature in Rails that you can provide the name of the database as a prefix to database URL. And so if we say primary database URL, and we do this again, our application record is going to use the values in the primary database URL. This is actually the default way it looks up your environment variables, and database URL is an exception just for the primary database. So that's used most often, but you could actually always specify primary database URL to do that instead. And these will take precedence over the fallback of database URL, or primary database URL will. But what's also great is we can do the same thing. I'm just going to change this, but you can supply them all. We can use one of our other database names like Q. And when we go to our solid Q job connection config, we're going to get a URL config this time instead of the hash config we had before. But it's the same name, the same environment. And when we ask it for the database, instead of getting a Rails 8 development queue back, we get DB, which came from the environment variable. So in production, when you deploy your Rails applications to wherever you host, you will be able to specify the primary database URL, or let me get rid of that, or the database URL for your main active record models. Then you can also specify the cache database URL, which will override this section. Then you can also specify the queue database URL, and you can specify the cable database URL. So these are the 4 environment variables you can use in production to override all of these production YAML configs as needed. This is kind of designed so that you provide a username and a password, and it's kind of, well, it's not even shared across these. You would actually have to copy paste the username and password to all these too. It's really designed so that you have to change it or specify these environment variables, but I never really knew these even existed with the prefix of the database name, which is super handy. So that's how you can deploy to production, and let's go take a look at the Rails source code to see how this works, because it's actually easier to find than you might expect. If we go to active record, we can go into lib active record, and oftentimes I'll just poke around at the file names to see if something catches my eye for that feature, because they're usually pretty well named. And if we look through this, database configurations.rb seems particularly relevant. And we know this because if we go into our terminal, we had an active record database configurations hash config or URL config. And so we can assume this is like the parent module or class that is creating these, namespace classes. And we can look here to see probably how that all works. And here you go. You have a database config, hash config, and a URL config. So there must be another way of doing this that we haven't actually used ourselves yet. But here we go. We can look at this source code. And I happen to know at the very bottom, if we look for the env in this file, we'll notice that this is where it looks up the environment variables for our databases. So it has a database name, it upcases it and looks for an environment variable named primary database URL, queue database URL, cable database URL, cache database URL. And it will use the value that it finds from there. Or if we're talking about just the primary database, it will also look at that database URL that doesn't have primary underscore at the beginning. So that falls back if there was no value. So if it was nil and you didn't have a primary database URL, it will look at database URL as well. And that's really all there is to this. You can see there's a merge database environment variables. So this will basically look at what's in the hash config and then merge them into the URL config. and basically have the environment stuff from the URL, and then fall back to, if you didn't specify like the pool in the URL, then it would use the pool in your database YAML. So let's take a look at that real quick. If we were to go and let me change the value of pool to something different. Let's say 10. If we go and look at our Q database URL, again, instead of doing it this way, we can look at the pool, and the pool size is 10, which clearly was not specified in our Q database URL anywhere, and is pulling from this ERB statement in our default config. And so basically, when we look at production, we have Q inherits from primary production. This is primary production, so it inherits all this stuff. Then Q overrides the database name, so it overrides this line, places it with that, adds migration paths, and sets that up. And then the database URL environment variable for Q can override these values and change that. But this is also inheriting from default. So then we also get all of these things up here. And so there's quite a bit of jumping around that actually happens here, but it's able to basically load this file, grab the stuff out of the environment and the name that you're looking for. And then because we have stuff in the environment variable, we can also make sure that those are the things that take the most precedence out of there. And I can't remember, I believe you can say like pool equals 25 as a query parameter, and that will override those other options that you might want to have in there as well. So you could set the encoding to something else if it was set in your database YAML to Unicode and you didn't want that for whatever reason. You have the flexibility with those URLs. And all of that is really kind of handled in this file in Rails. And this is where it figures out, hey, where did that come from? What do we do with it? And all that. And then you can use these files to kind of look and see, how does this work? So for example, connection resolver new URL, it's the one that parses that URL into a hash for you. So it can pull out things like the timeout and the pool and the username and password and give you them back. And so that's how that works. And then you can look at URL config and database config and stuff like that. And it's all pretty straightforward. This one, you can see there's stuff where if the value is false, it actually converts it to the Boolean of false instead of the string of false, and cleans up a few little things like that for you, which is handy. And that's about it. There is not a lot to it. And this is, I guess the parent class for these. So hash config inherits from database config. So that's kind of the base functionality, and implements more or less the interface you have to implement for your own config classes. So the raise is not implemented errors, because this is basically an abstract class to allow it to be an easy interface that you can implement just by looking at these. You inherit from it, override those methods, and should be good to go. So yeah, that's how this works in Rails. It's surprisingly easy, but is one of those things that if you've never looked into it before, like I've never looked into it before, feels a little bit like a mystery. There's not maybe documentation good enough at the moment on these environment variable names that you might need. And so that's something that hopefully will get improved shortly. Now that Rails 8 includes those multiple databases out of the box, you can expect people to be contributing, or you can contribute to the docs and make this better yourself. And this is great because we don't have to modify the YAML file for production and specify our own URLs. This is a good option too if you would like to supply something else as well. So that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you understand multiple databases a little bit better now. There really isn't a lot of magic to it. They've just done a lot of things that you will eventually have to do it yourself, and so they made shortcuts for you. It's just a matter of knowing that those shortcuts exist for things like this. So that is it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you in the next one. Peace.